Thank you very much for this opportunity to present this paper to you. My name is Isaac Mbiti, and I'll be presenting the paper Back to Basics, Curriculum Reform and Student Learning in Tanzania. This is joint work with Daniel Rodriguez Segura. Real quick, just to give you an overview of the structure of the presentation, we'll first go over the motivation and background, and then we'll jump into the data and empirical methods that we use, and then we will discuss the results and conclude. Curricula are key components of education systems. On a high level, they set the visions, objectives, goals of an education system. And this is translated to a lower classroom level almost, where it determines what teachers teach and what students are expected to know. Curricula also shape the trajectory of skill progression among students. So they outline the order in which the student is going to learn skills. They also enable systems to adopt strategies such as entrance and exit examinations, which enable them to ration or control the progression of students to the next levels of education. So for example, over 30 African countries have primary school exit examinations which they use to ration entry to secondary school. Now, there are concerns that the curricula that have been adopted in many developing countries are overambitious, in that they are not well aligned with the current needs and skills and backgrounds of students. And there has been a number of studies that have argued that the current curricula are biased towards the elite. They're structured to favor the children of the elites. They are also designed in a way that produces a well-educated elite. And so what this means, though, is that the materials, the textbooks, the lessons, they're just far beyond the level of the average student. And what this leads to is often teachers focusing on covering the curriculum, or when you pair that with that behavior, I should say, of teachers sort of focusing on covering the curriculum due to their incentives, that often is going to leave students behind, because teachers are focusing on getting through the whole syllabus rather than on building skills. And so what this can lead to is a lot of students being left behind. And since there are no incentives or structures to support students who are left behind, this can really have detrimental impacts on learning profiles. Simplifying the curriculum could improve learning, especially for students who are outside the top quantiles. There's a nice quote in Poor Economics by Banerjee and Deflo. They say, if the curriculum was radically simplified, then the vast majority of students would get something from the years they spend in school. And this sentiment is echoed by Kaffenberger and Pritchett in a recent paper, where they also say, like, slowing the pace of the curriculum to ensure most children have mastered a skill before instruction moves on could enable more children to learn for more years while in school. And again, this is the idea that curriculum are going too fast. Maybe we should slow it down. Now, on the other hand, we could overcorrect and slow things down too much, which would reduce learning, because we're going way too slowly. And so it's a tricky balance that we have to try and achieve in terms of getting this just right. Now, there's limited evidence, I think, on just this broad curriculum, the impacts of broad curriculum simplifications. There are promising results from interventions that promote, so to speak, teaching at the right level, computer-aided instruction, remedial education, among others. But again, we need more of this type of evidence. And I think this is especially important now, given what we're seeing around in many different developing countries, which are curriculum shifts towards what is known as competency-based curriculums. So what do we do in this paper? We are going to study the impacts of curriculum reforms in Tanzania. So in 2015, the government made some changes where they simplified the curriculum for grades 1 and 2. Very briefly, what they did was essentially focus on reading, writing, and arithmetic in math and Kiswahili. And they essentially downplayed or reduced the amount of time spent on other subjects, including eliminating English altogether. So what we're going to do is use a quasi-experimental difference in difference approach combined with sort of some nice data to really evaluate and examine the impacts of this on student learning. What's important to also know is that this curriculum change was part of a package of reforms known as Big Results Now in education. And so there was a lot of things happening at the same time, and so we have to be careful about attributing anything we see in our empirics to this curriculum reform itself. And so to sort of assuage some of these concerns, what we do is we conduct several robustness checks just to sort of make sure that we are picking up the curriculum effects. What we find is that the reform increased student learning across the board. And we didn't really see any negative effects of slowing the curriculum on top students, which you might be concerned about, that if we slow it then the top students might not benefit as much. And so this is consistent with sort of the proponents of teaching at the right level and sort of slowing down the curriculum. So just for some context, in Tanzania, we've seen a pretty dramatic increase in enrollment over the past 30 years. The enrollment has unfortunately not translated into better learning outcomes. So from a number of different assessments, from Taweza, the WESO data, we're seeing that, for example, 1 out of every 3 third graders couldn't do any addition or subtraction exercises, or even write a short word in Kiswahili. Right? So not much learning was going on. So in 2013, the government started implementing Big Results Now in education. And these were several contemporaneous reforms that included teacher accountability, some school level incentives, and a curricular reform. What are some of the details of this curriculum reform? Well, in 2015, the government changed or simplified the curriculum for grades 1 and 2. Prior to this, the curriculum was overloaded with subjects. So in grade 1, you'd be studying Kiswahili, math, and English, but you'd also be studying science, vocational education, vocational topics, ICT, personality, games, and sports. And so teachers are, again, focused more on just getting through the curriculum rather than sort of on developing basic reading and writing skills. And so what this new curriculum did was strip most of that away and just have teachers focused on the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. So English was also eliminated from grades 1 and 2. And what they tried to do was to integrate some of science and other subjects into Kiswahili and math. The rollout obviously varied from school to school. For example, in our data, 4 out of 10 teachers didn't receive any materials to teach them the curriculum. So there were some teething implementation problems. I will now describe our data and empirical strategy. The data that we use in the study comes from 10 districts in Tanzania, where we had conducted a previous RCT. These are national representative. We have a panel of 60 schools from 2013 to 2016. We have students that we follow in those schools from grades 1 to 3 in 2013 to 2016, and then in 2015 and 16 we also add grade 4. We have data on test scores for each of these students. We also have some teacher surveys, and we also have school surveys. Our test scores, we have item level data on Kiswahili, English, and math. And that's going to be our primary outcome that we use. And these are grade specific, tied to the syllabus test items. The tests are built on the UWEZO test framework. So the UWEZO tests are a nationwide early grade assessment that's been used in Tanzania over the past decade. Our tests follow a very similar structure, and so they're going to be structured very similarly and comparably across time, although the items are not going to be exactly identical. So just to give you an idea, grade 1 math test is going to feature items on counting, just counting how many shapes, for example. Number recognition, we show you the student a number and ask them to recognize a number, and number discrimination. Is this number bigger than that number? Okay. In Swahili and English as well, we ask them to read in grade 3, for example. We ask the students to read a paragraph, and we measure how well they are at reading, and then we also measure their reading comprehension. So we're going to use a difference in difference strategy to examine the impact of this reform. So the reform is 2015-2016, those are the years of the reform, and the pre-reform periods that we have in our data are 2013-2014. And what we're going to do is essentially compare learning in grades 1 and 2 compared to grades 3 and 4, pre and post reform, okay, with the idea that grade 1 and 2 are going to be essentially treated with the reform, and grade 3 and 4 are not. And so by sort of differencing, we can learn something about the effect of the reform. Of course, we have to be careful about parallel trends, which we test for, and we see that there's good evidence that these cohorts follow these parallel trends. And so we're going to use a classic difference in difference framework. And if you look at our estimating equation, the outcome of interest that we want to focus on is that interaction term, the coefficient of the interaction term, beta 3. We're going to look at the test scores that we measure in our data. And again, that's going to be math, English, and Kiswahili test scores. So what do we find? So jumping into the results. So I'm going to present these graphically. And this is just the estimates of the difference in difference effects. So here on the left, here we see in the blue and the yellow, Kiswahili is in the blue, math is in the yellow. And what we're seeing is that the reform increases learning by about 0.18 of a standard deviation in Kiswahili and about 0.55 of a standard deviation in math. And we see a negative but insignificant effect in English, which is to be expected. Again, we're moving away from English, and so we would expect, we wouldn't expect big positive effects in English. We can look a little bit deeper into the exam results, and we can see that in math, in the top panel, we see an increase across most topics and subtopics, so counting, recognizing numbers, inequalities, addition, subtraction. But we don't really see big effects here in multiplication and division. Again, we're sort of increasing in the complexity of tasks as we go from left to right. And so this is again suggesting that at least for math, we are seeing a focus on core skills. In English, we don't see much of an effect on syllables or words. I mean, we see a little bit, but we see bigger effects here on sentences, writing words, and reading comprehension. And in English, we're seeing, again, not much of a change, but we're seeing a huge sort of reduction here in reading comprehension. Again, so overall, what we're seeing is that there is sort of variance in sort of what skills were affected across the different topics. We can now look at heterogeneity by a number of factors. We first look at heterogeneity by a proxy of implementation fidelity, which is whether or not the schools had teachers trained in the new curriculum. And when teachers were trained in this new curriculum, the treatment effects of the reform were much larger. So, for example, Kiswahili effects go up to now 0.45 over standard deviation. When we look at student characteristics, heterogeneity by student characteristics, we actually don't see much differences across those student characteristics. So we don't find any differences between students who had low test scores at baseline versus high test scores at baseline. We don't find any differences between boys and girls in terms of the effects of this reform. We also don't find any differences between rural and urban students, again, with respect to the effects of this reform. And so what this leads us to sort of understand that the reform helped students of all characteristics improve their learning outcomes, which is an important finding. There doesn't seem to be any evidence that it hurt certain students. We'll now examine robustness. So the first thing we want to look at is, are our results robust to other big results now initiatives? So the initiatives included a school improvement kit, which sort of delivered sort of handbooks, manuals, training to school management. Included capitation grant reforms, and it also included a STEP program, which was a remedial training or remedial education program. But again, this was targeted mostly at upper level grades. So we can see whether or not, for example, if your school received this, do we see any evidence that our diff and diff is different along any of these dimensions? And what we see in column 2, 3, and 4 is that, again, when we look at these components, we don't see any differences in our results. And again, that suggests that these BRN activities are not driving our results. The other BRN activities were targeted at grade 7 and above, and so they're not really going to be pertinent to the results here. Next, we can examine whether the reform changed student composition. So we might be concerned that we might draw in students that are different from what we used to. And we can look at this by, one, looking at the age, the gender, and some other household characteristics of students. And essentially, we don't see any differences across a number of different measures. Again, so I suggest that there was no change in composition driven by this reform. Finally, we can look at the impacts on grade 7 exams. So we might be worried that we are picking up some other effect. And so we can sort of use this as a placebo test. The grade 7 national examination is, again, a high stakes exam that both for this, especially for the student, because it determines their progression to the next level, but also for the school because it's what they use to build reputation. So we can sort of set up our diff and diff in a similar way, but now comparing our control group to grade 7. And what we find again is no change. And again, so this suggests that we are really finding and identifying the sort of curriculum reform effects because we're not seeing any spillovers into grade 7. Moving to our discussion. So wrapping up, we've shown you using a difference in difference framework and a national representative panel data survey that the curriculum reform, which again slowed down the pace of the curriculum, narrowed the curriculum, that increased learning outcomes for students. And these gains were across the board, across males, females, across rural, urban students, across students with low and high test scores at baseline. There was a small decline in English as well, but that's to be expected because we were moving away from English. We see suggestive evidence that the implementation mattered, whereby training teachers had a big impact on the efficacy of and effectiveness of the program. And so we, I think, need to do a little bit more work to unpack these results, but also I think to do a little bit more work on the test comparability. One thing we also want to do is, I think, bring in additional data to sort of enrich our understanding of what happened and how teachers responded, for example. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening. There's additional slides that just show some background information as well.